Nicaragua becomes the 10th country to join China's International Research Station initiative. JP update number 33, Nordics training international military pilots to fly flying saucers. The FBI file has a statement about Nikola Tesla being dropped off as a baby. A news article on the Pentagon lying about UFO sightings shows despair among many researchers over recent pushback against official disclosure initiatives. Nazi Germany used a global network of tunnels to create a Fourth Reich with flying saucers. Was Edgar Casey's prophecy that Russia would be the hope of the world against the sons of Belial just fulfilled? These stories and more on Exopolitics Today, the Week in Review.
You are listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Welcome to Exopolitics Today, the Week in Review. This is May 4, and it has been a fascinating week. There really has been many significant things on the international scene that have occurred, even though as far as the UFO front is involved, things have been very, very slow. But in the field of exopolitics, we look at the big picture and things definitely are heating up, and there has been some really big developments that I want to discuss. So let's begin with a tweet about China just signing up Nicaragua as the 10th country to join its International Lunar Research Station initiative. So the other signatories to that initiative are currently Azerbaijan, Belarus, Egypt, Pakistan, Russia, South Africa, Thailand, and Venezuela. So apart from Russia and China, we can see that all of those countries that are part of this International Lunar Research Station don't have much, if at all, anything in the way of a national space station or a national space program. Now, in contrast, NASA's Artemis Accords has 39 signatory nations, including the world's major spacefaring nations. So in the Artemis Accords, you have the United States, France, Britain, Germany having all signed up, Canada, Australia, India, Brazil. All the major countries have signed up, apart from those that have joined China's Research Station initiative. Now, what this tells us is that China is definitely on the long haul in terms of developing a space alliance, starting off with this civilian space alliance that will also eventually morph into a military space alliance. Now, with NASA's Artemis Accords, that's strictly a civilian set of accords, bilateral accords between the United States and 38 other countries, making a total of 39. And those Artemis Accords, within them, there are provisions talking about safety zones. And those safety zones would be protected by signatories to the Artemis Accords. And that's where the military dimension comes in. And so you have something called the Combined Space Operations Initiative, and that currently includes the major Five Eyes countries, the US, Canada, Australia, Britain, also France, Germany, and Japan, and Italy has also signed up. So that's the military side of the Artemis Accords. So what eventually will happen for both this space alliance that the US has and the Artemis Accords and China's and Russia's International Space Alliance is that you will have two competing blocks of nations that are conducting military operations or civilian operations in space, and that they are going to have diverging interests. And both are going to have military forces that are going to be protecting the different projects and activities of each one. So if, for example, India a signatory to the Artemis Accords, sets up a mining mission, say on Phobos, the moon of Mars, one of the moons of Mars. It sets up a mining mission. And then another country, say China, sets up a mining mission also on Phobos. Well, what could happen is that China's mining mission could interfere with India's mining mission, and that's where you would actually have the military alliance coming in, which will currently that's called the Combined Space Operations Initiative. That will morph into something like a space NATO or a Starfleet. Okay, now one of the other key elements about China setting up its own rival space alliance to what the US did with the Artemis Accords is that China is hoping that visiting extraterrestrials will choose to deal with them as opposed to the US and signatories to the Artemis Accords. Because back in 2021, I covered a story concerning a set of meetings on Jupiter. And those meetings on Jupiter decided that the United States would be the lead nation on Earth for these space alliances cooperating. So that was something I covered back in 2021. And this was something that was not to the liking of China or Russia. And more recently, I've done some interviews with Thorhan Eredyan, as he is relayed through Elena Danan. Now, Thorhan is a high commander with the Galactic Federation of Worlds, and he has said that the framework of the agreements that were reached on Jupiter between the US and other major spacefaring nations and these extraterrestrial alliances, those agreements create the framework for various things to happen, like civilian exploration, trading in particular, military activities, but that China has chosen to go it alone. It's chosen to go outside of that and set up its own alliance. So this, I think, is also another factor in why China is setting up its own space alliance, because I think what it's planned to do is that in the future, China will want to build up credibility as an alternative to the United States so that it can take over leadership of the international space community from Earth. And I think that's what China is laying the foundations for. And China's strategists are famous for developing long-term plans. So, this is not going to happen in the next 5 years or something. It's good. What I think China has in mind is to build up an alliance that, say, in another 20 years, by the year 2050, will be powerful enough and extensive enough in terms of members to be able to legitimately claim to extraterrestrial alliances and say, look, we, China, are the true leaders of planet Earth. And so that's going to be, I think, what their game plan is. Here's an update from JP, and in this update, he talks about Nordic extraterrestrials training international military pilots to fly flying saucers. So this was an update that was released on Monday, April 29, and JP described going to an underground spaceport somewhere in the Alabama region. And he thinks that it's the same one that he visited a year ago, where he saw fleets of flying saucer-shaped craft landing and taking off with lots of ground activity in terms of Nordic-looking extraterrestrials and humans. Now he says that he went along with a group of 30 military pilots. He and another individual were the only non-pilots. The other 30 were military pilots from many nations. And when they arrived at that underground base, they walked over to specific planes or specific flying saucer craft greeted a Nordic extraterrestrial and then proceeded to go in, and they were training to fly these spacecraft. So what we have here is that there is a joint cooperation or some kind of agreement in play whereby this particular group of Nordic extraterrestrials that have fleets of flying saucer craft in this underground location somewhere in the Alabama region, that they have an agreement to train not only US pilots, but pilots from all over the world. Maybe some Australians are in there. Some of those, and all of those pilots are being trained, and they will be able to fly these flying saucers. So there, that's his update, number 33. So here's some helpful information about the history of the inner Earth civilizations and a meeting that took place in the Himalayas in late 2023, according to Elena Danan. So her information in this, I think it was her week in review. That's right. The week in review for April 29, Star Nation News number 28. So they come out on Monday nights, and definitely they're worth listening to. So in that particular week in review, she talks about a meeting that took place in the Himalayas in late 2023, where inner Earth civilizations, both human-looking beings, we're talking Telosians, for example, and also non-human looking underground civilizations, what people call cryptoids, cryptids, that they went to this meeting with the Galactic Federation and other extraterrestrial civilizations to reach some kind of consensus over future disclosure initiatives and what's happening on Earth. And her information about these non-human looking underground civilizations going back hundreds of millions of years matches what I've been able to learn through other sources. So we're talking independent sources. So Elena's information comes from the Galactic Federation and her communications with Thorhan and others. My information comes from different sources. For example, there is Sumbo True Brothers, the Sasquatch Message to Humanity, that I think presents a very compelling case about the true history of our planet. And of course, you have legends of indigenous peoples also talking about things such as the Ant people. So definitely well worth watching that particular episode of Star Nations News. Okay, so here we have a tweet from an individual, Vicky Verma, who says Nikola Tesla was an alien from Venus. An FBI file says, in the archives of the FBI's official website, there is a very mysterious document, Interplanetary Sessions newsletter, that contains a very unusual statement concerning Nikola Tesla. So what that statement discusses is a book that was released back in, I think it was in the, I'm not quite sure the date, but sometime in the 50s or 60s, a book by Margaret Storm. And she talked about information that she had received. And I think Arthur Matthews was a source for her, who was a protege of Nikola Tesla. And according to Arthur Matthews, he was a contactee, and he says he was told by his contacts that Nikola Tesla had been dropped off as a baby by Venusian extraterrestrials or extraterrestrials with bases on Venus. And also that Tesla himself believed that he had been dropped off as a baby. Now, what's very interesting here is that there is a leaked 1989 Defense Intelligence Agency document that describes the 1948 Aztec UFO crash having extraterrestrial babies being left behind for US authorities, and that some babies were also dropped off. Along with the spacecraft to the Soviet Union in order to maintain the global balance. So extraterrestrials, when they do this, and we're talking about human-looking extraterrestrials who plan that their human-looking offspring would be raised as normal humans, pardon me, but they would have precocious abilities like Nikola Tesla, and that would be a way for organically influencing human evolution to kind of like speed it up a little bit, because extraterrestrials that are raised among us, what we're talking about is a extraterrestrial body, or an extraterrestrial soul, the consciousness of which has been transferred into a cloned body that has human genetics as well as extraterrestrial genetics, so that that baby can grow up safely on Earth. So if you got, for example, a pure Venusian or a pure Pleiadian and just drop them off as a baby, that baby would probably die because they're not used to our Earth conditions. So what they do, the way it's been explained to me, is that first they create a clone or a genetically modified hybrid, mixing the genetics of both the extraterrestrials and humans, so that when that baby is dropped off and the soul consciousness of the being is transferred into it, it has a lot of its memories, a lot of the skills that soul had developed, but now it can survive in the Earth environment. Now, the idea of babies being dropped off by extraterrestrials is something that a lot of people would have difficulty with. This FBI document that discusses it really just raises the observation that, there were people like Margaret Storm that believed Tesla was dropped off as a baby, but there are credible sources like this leaked 1988 document showing that in fact is a process. So in my tweet, you also have a follow-up tweet where I discuss this. The New Majestic document reveals U.S. diplomatic relations with extraterrestrials. So on my website, exopolitics.org, this article is there. It discusses this leaked document. It discusses how the extraterrestrials wanted to give these 6-month-old infants to U.S. authorities to be raised as children, and also how that was something that was going to be replicated for the Soviet Union. So very, very interesting story. Okay, so here's an article from John Hines, and this article discusses, it's on a website called Ultra Unlimited. So it discusses the ultra-terrestrial theory. And what he basically argues is that the UFO phenomenon, as it's currently being debated in mainstream circles, hinges on, well, are these secret government craft, corporate craft being tested? So are they advanced human craft that are being secretly built and tested in special access programs, or are they extraterrestrial spacecraft? That seems to be the debate. And what he's suggesting is that there's also the third possibility, that they are ultra-terrestrials, that they are a shadow intelligence in Earth's hidden ecosystem. So we're talking about not necessarily beings that are interdimensionals like fairies, goblins, ghosts, like Jacques Vallée made famous with his book Passport to Magonia. But we're talking about like cryptoids. We're talking about, say, Sasquatch. We're talking about the Nagas, the snake people. We're talking about the ant people. We're talking about civilizations in Earth's underground regions where they have flourishing civilizations with advanced technologies, flying saucer craft. So I think that's a very important thesis, and it's something that really does need to be brought more into the debate. That and he points out in his article that this ultra-terrestrial hypothesis stems from the premise that these civilizations once lived on the surface of Earth, but because of Earth catastrophes, that they went underground for safety, that they went down there for refuge, and that there's very large, huge cavern complexes under the Earth that are much safer than the surface of the planet that's always going through major changes. So I think that's a very important thesis. Now, here's an episode of Weaponized featuring George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell. And they put out some very interesting information, some of it definitely worth considering. And I think this is an example of where they have elements in there that I think are spot on, but other elements that I think raise important questions. So I wanted to go through the different elements in this Weaponized episode that I either agree or disagree with, and just offer that for your own contemplation. So here you have, they're making the case, and I agree with them, that Sean Kirkpatrick, the former director of the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, that really amounted to a counterintelligence operation to find out which whistleblowers were leaking UFO-related information and effectively neutralizing them. So I think that was a very good point that they brought up, and I think George Knapp also used the term that the Arrow office was effectively and continues now to put out UFO propaganda of a skeptical kind. Now, the other point that I thought that they raised that was very good was this prospective special access program initiative called Kona Blue that George Knapp had known about in a book that he had written about the Skinwalker Ranch about a dozen years ago with, I think it's Bob Kelleher, and I think Gene Lakowski, if I got that right. But he had written a book, and they had discussed that prospective Department of Homeland Security special access program called Kona Blue, that George Knapp said that they couldn't publicly identify it, but they talked about it because they knew what it was. And he explains that it never took off, that the Kona Blue prospective special access program, it involved officials within the Department of Homeland Security that thought that the UFO issue wasn't a legitimate one for the Department of Homeland Security to investigate, that they put in place this prospective special access program, and they knocked on a few doors in kind of like other government agencies and the military, saying, "Well, hey, we're doing this study on UFOs and UFO technologies. What can you tell us?" And they got nothing. And what was the final result was that the Department of Homeland Security said that, well, there's nothing to this UFO issue, that there's no evidence to it, when in fact the doors were closed. So it wasn't that there wasn't any evidence concerning UFOs, it was that the Department of Homeland Security was cut out of the loop. The door was slammed shut on its representatives in getting access to classified UFO files. But in writing up its report about Kona Blue, the Department of Homeland Security framed it that not that, well, we don't have the clout to be able to get into the classified files that the Office of Naval Intelligence has, or that the Department of Energy has, or Department of State has, that we don't have that kind of clout. They would just say, well, there was no evidence that was found that any of this is real. And so what George Knapp pointed out, and I thought that was very helpful, was that in releasing the Kona Blue document, in declassifying it and publicly releasing it, that this was yet another counterintelligence operation, just more clever propaganda by Sean Kirkpatrick and Arrow, because Sean Kirkpatrick continues to be a senior consultant with the Arrow office, as I understand it. So he's still having a big influence in how it's run. And he pointed out okay, so, and he pointed out, George Knapp pointed out that when he was working on the Skinwalker Ranch and working with the Bigelow Aerospace Corporation, that Lockheed Martin or Skunk Works possessed crashed UFO material and offered it to Bigelow Aerospace for study, but that the Lockheed Martin was prevented from releasing the that material to the Bigelow Aerospace Corporation. So there you had around 2008, 2009, when the Bigelow Aerospace Corporation was being funded by the US Senate. It was conducting studies for the defense intelligence community, that these were released as defense intelligence reference documents, that it got, supposedly it got its hands on some UFO debris, and that Skunk Works or Lockheed had more debris or more UFO related material that it wanted to share with Bigelow Aerospace, but that it was blocked from doing so. Now, this is where I disagree with George Knapp, and I think it's a very important disagreement. Knapp said that Lockheed had been unsuccessful with its reverse engineering efforts of the retrieved UFO material. So, according to George Knapp's rendition, Lockheed's Skunk Work had this UFO debris for years or decades. It couldn't work it out. So it thought, well, why don't we just give it over to Bigelow Aerospace and maybe they'll figure out something. Maybe they have some bright spark who can understand what's going on here, because we couldn't figure it out. Now, I think that is wrong. And I don't know where George Knapp got that idea. Maybe that is a cover story that is put out. I mean, one of the things that I really appreciate from Richard Hoagland, a former mainstream news reporter, science reporter, who did a number of best-selling books on Mars, The Face on Mars, and so forth. He made the very important insight that the lie is different at every level. And I think that what George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell have bought into is a lie at a level. And the level is, it's a little deeper, like, UFOs are real. UFO crashes have occurred. They have been recovered. Some of these UFOs involve non-human intelligence, and they have been recovered, but that corporations and military scientists have been unsuccessful in their attempts to reverse engineer these recovered technologies and biological specimens. Now, that, I believe, is wrong, and we can look at none other than the former CEO of Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works, that is Ben Rich, and he, as he was getting close, as he entered his retirement years, he gave public lectures, and at some of his lectures he confided to engineers that yes, that Lockheed had been able to successfully reverse engineer some of these craft, that they could now take ET home, that he would very famously finish his lectures saying that we have now, Lockheed has developed the technologies to take ET home. So what else could that mean other than that Lockheed Martin Skunk Works had been successful in reverse engineering some of the captured extraterrestrial technologies? And more importantly, he was saying that that Lockheed had fleets of these things, that would take an act of God to get this material out to the general public. So what he was saying there is that these reverse engineered Lockheed Skunk Work alien craft, alien reproduction vehicles, are so highly classified that even terms like unacknowledged waived special access program might not be sufficient in terms of security classification to denote exactly what that program involves. So I think that's where Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, I think, are wrong, quite simply. Now, And finally, in that episode of Weaponized, they talk about this study that the Bigelow Aerospace Corporation had done on 100 military personnel that had gotten injured for getting too close to UFOs. So this is something that was, I think, made famous because Tucker Carlson said that he was told by a Stanford medical researcher about this, while George Knapp is saying that this was part of a study that was commissioned by the Bigelow Aerospace Corporation that was being funded by the US Senate to study what happened to people or military personnel that got too close to UFOs. And there are 100 personnel that got injured or killed for doing that. Now, and George Knapp points out that this is where consciousness comes in, that the consciousness of individuals that are approaching craft or want to interact with these craft is very, very important. And I agree with that. And I already talked about JP's update 33, where he says that he went to that underground cavern in Alabama and he saw these human military pilots being trained by Nordics. And part of the training involved the human pilot's consciousness being able to handle the advanced mind technology systems that are in these spacecraft. And this is also a reason why contactees such as JP have been recruited for these kinds of projects, is because they have the right consciousness, the right genetics to safely interact with extraterrestrial spacecraft and these ancient technologies that stem from civilizations going back hundreds of or thousands of years ago. And that's very important because as this study that Knapp and Tucker Carlson referred to of 100 military personnel that got too close to UFOs, is that it doesn't matter. I mean, you might be whatever your rank is, and in the military, I mean, you get to a rank of colonel, or I mean, you got to be pretty bright to get to the rank like that, or you get to become an E7, a master sergeant, command sergeant major, or whatever. You got to be pretty bright to reach that rank, but you might get fried when you touch or get too close to these UFOs. So it's not just intelligence. It's not just levels of education that matter. It's really your consciousness and your genetics. And there are people like JP and many other contactees who are much more heart-centric. And that gives them this ability to be able to interact safely with these crafts. So, and that is, I think, a very important point. So, yeah, some good points that raised in the Weaponized episode, but also I think something that I strongly disagree with in that. Okay, so James Fox is coming out with a new documentary. And here's a tweet that he put out. So this is what I was responding to. Those who know me are familiar with my work, know I fiercely go the extra mile to weed out unsupportable claims. And so he's talking about his new upcoming documentary, and one of the witnesses that he interviewed for that documentary, Jason Sands, that he met Jason over a year ago and talked about his experiences concerning UFOs. And in his due diligence, he confirmed that Jason Sands was in the military. For example, he's released his DD-214 that shows he served with the US Air Force for 22 years, and that he's willing to testify under oath and take a polygraph test regarding his claims. But then he qualifies it, saying, nonetheless, as with other whistleblowers who go public, this doesn't mean that what he has stated shouldn't be questioned regarding apparent inconsistencies and difficult to resolve claims. So what is it that James Fox is responding to here? Well, this is what I bring out in my tweet. Okay, so the main reason, and it's very clear here, the main reason Sands has become controversial among many UFO researchers for making unsupportable claims is that he has said that he served on a 20 and back which implies the existence of a secret space program. Now, this is the big debate within the UFO and exopolitical communities. And I already mentioned George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell, that in their opinion, that these extraterrestrial craft have been recovered, they've been studied by top corporations, but they have not been successfully reverse engineered. Bob Lazar said the same thing. Both Corbell and Knapp are famously associated with Bob Lazar. So they take that approach that, yes, these recovered craft are too advanced and they have not been reverse engineered. And they will tell you that you can take that to the bank, I guess. In other words, they're very confident about that. And so they and many others say that those who make these unsupportable claims that they've been involved in secret space programs or been on these 20 and back missions where they spend 20 years in space and then they're brought back and they relive the timeline, that's just these are unsupportable claims. And so that's where I beg to differ with them. And that's why there is this debate over Jason Sands. So many researchers are just very dubious about such claims. Now, I've been aware of these claims going back to Michael Ralph in the year 2000. And I first talked about Michael Ralph's testimony in my 2004 book, Exopolitics, Political Implications of the Extraterrestrial Presence. So I mentioned Michael Ralph in that book. Now, this is a very important precedent that Ralph and many others after him, I mean, the next person to talk about it was Randy Kramer in 2014. They talk about being part of these 20 and back programs where they're recruited typically during boot camp. They're recruited to go into a secret space program where they would have their memories wiped at the end of it, but they would serve their country. And they say, yes, they're young recruits in the military and they'd go off and do it. And so this pattern has been repeated with many others who have credible military backgrounds, including most recently Jason Rice. And so this controversy really stems from, unfortunately, it's these myopic UFO researchers that want to make ufology a credible science like astronomy, where everything is empirically testable and all hypotheses need to be supported by empirical data that is verified through kind of scientifically calibrated instruments to be able to reach firm conclusions. Whereas in truth, the UFO phenomenon has been a political national security issue since at least the Second World War, where it's been known by the major military services and intelligence community that these are non-human intelligences, either extraterrestrial off-world visitors or beings from the inner earth visiting us, and sometimes their craft are shot down, they're crashed and they're recovered. And so this has been a national security issue, and so an elaborate system has been set up based on lies, ridicule, intimidation, assassination, to keep this all under wraps. And of course, you have people that say, well, ufology is a science, like any science, like astronomy. You need to test things. Well, how can you test things when you have witnesses being intimidated, silenced, evidence confiscated, primary whistleblowers assassinated or disappeared? How can you do that? I mean, this is why, in a way, trying to expose the UFO cover-up is almost similar to dealing with organized crime, where, and this is known, that organized crime, whenever you had witnesses or evidence concerning Al Capone doing something, then that witness or the evidence would disappear. Witnesses would be bribed, would be intimidated, would be killed. Public officials would be bribed would be asked to turn the cheek, and important evidence disappears. And so Al Capone walked free on many cases, and they finally got him on tax evasion, and that was it. He got away with murder. So the same thing here with the UFO cover-up. It is a national security issue, and unfortunately, there are too many people among UFO researchers that want to make ufology a clean-cut science with empirical, verifiable evidence, and it's just not that. It's messy because you have witnesses, you have eyewitnesses who are complex, who have families, who have careers. Their reasons for coming forward can be very, very complex. Part of them is wanting the truth to come out, but another part of them is, shit scared that their family is going to be intimidated or hurt because of them coming forward. So so to just say, well, show me all your evidence, it's just not going to fly. Okay, here's a article by Marik Von Rennenkampff that the Pentagon is lying about UFO sightings. So here's his article in The Hill, which is a mainstream newspaper or online paper now. I think there's probably still a written edition of The Hill, but I think a lot of mainstream papers are going digital now. But anyway, so this has long been a mainstream paper covering the US Congress. And so in this article by Marik Von Rennenkampff, he discusses the Pentagon is lying about UFOs, and he goes into detail into what these lies are. So, and I think what's happened is that, and this is what he points out, is that top leadership positions in the Pentagon have decided that too much has been revealed in official venues. So you've had congressional hearings where whistleblowers have come forward. You've had videos that have been officially acknowledged by the Navy to be genuine, that have been leaked and then accepted as genuine by the Navy. So there are officials that say, well, too much of this UFO material has been authenticated by officials, public officials, and we're going to close the door on that. So while the door is currently being shut, other doors are being open. So there's still a lot of whistleblowers, insiders that are continuing to come forward discussing UFO-related programs with the support of their covert military officials, and there's quite a number of whistleblowers and experiences that are talking about what they have seen and experienced. So while on the one hand, you've got the kind of official cover-up of the UFO issue going into high drive after a period of a couple of years where the things were relaxed, information was coming out. There was a lot of excitement about Congress passing the UAP Disclosure Act for 2023 that looked like it was a sure thing at one point, but then it got scuttled at the last minute. So UFO researchers were expecting a lot for 2024, and the door seems to be shutting. And that's where this article by Marik Von Rennenkampff is very helpful in outlining where the Pentagon is lying. But it also points out the kind of frustration and the despair among many UFO researchers that the official information has stopped, that conduit, that pipeline has been shut. And so many of them are now thinking, well, nothing of note is happening. But in fact, there's a lot that's happening. The number of contactees, experiences coming forward has never been higher. We're learning so much about different extraterrestrial civilizations, inner Earth beings, and we've got credible people that are coming forward. I've mentioned Jason Sands, a new one, talking about secret space programs. We've got JP, the active military serviceman that I've been working with for 16 years now. We've got Elena Danan. We've got Jean-Charles Moyen. We've got many other credible people coming forward with amazing information and evidence, solid evidence that supports their cases. So I think more UFO researchers should start to look at that information rather than having a myopic focus on what public officials release or prepared to accept. Okay, so here's a interview I did with Dr. Anton Anfilov, where he discusses his research into the Nazi Germany's development of flying saucer craft and how they had help from inner Earth beings. Now, the thing of note concerning Dr. Anfilov is that he has interviewed and seen official documents from the Soviet Union and from the Russian Federation going back decades, going back into the 1980s. And so he's very familiar with a lot of the things that happened in the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, and also about some of the Nazi Germany sources. And his research has confirmed that Nazi Germany did, in fact, develop fleets of flying saucers, and that they had relocated these into underground tunnels and systems, but not just in Antarctica. He identified other areas in Argentina, in Greenland, Sweden. He identified some prominent Swedish industrialist families that helped with the Nazis, development of their flying saucer craft. The Wallenberg family that has been involved in the aviation industry in Sweden for decades, that they were involved. And he describes this, he calls it the symbiote underground and space terrestrial non-human civilization SUSTANK. And what that refers to is his belief that the flying saucer craft, or the UFOs that we see in the skies, whether they're cigar-shaped flying saucer craft and so forth, that many of these, not all of them, but many of these actually originate from inner Earth civilizations. And so he believes that these insectoid praying mantis beings, that they're at the top of the hierarchy, and then underneath them are these reptilians, and then you have the others like the Sasquatch and so forth, and then eventually humans that were created in successive genetic experiments, and that there are these underground bases or caverns where these civilizations live, and that the Nazis cooperated with this SUSTANK civilization to build out a Fourth Reich, so that the Nazis were able to establish a breakaway civilization, a Fourth Reich, from the ashes of the defeat of the Third Reich. And so it has flourished, that the Fourth Reich has flourished with flying saucers. And so Dr. Anfilov, he has presented quite a lot of data that he has uncovered on this issue, on the Nazis having been successful in developing fleets of flying saucer craft, and that they are operating even today, and that they're being helped by this consortium of underground civilizations. And so that brings me back to the point I was discussing earlier, that George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell and many other researchers, David Grush makes a similar point, that the non-human intelligence technologies that are falling into the hands of corporations and the military intelligence community are too advanced to be reverse engineered. There's been no success in reverse engineering that in those things. Well, if you think about it, if Nazi Germany back in the 1940s was able to reverse engineer these captured or these extraterrestrial spacecraft that were given to them, according to William Tompkins. He says that they were given prototypes, many different, up to 38 different prototypes, according to William Tompkins, that the Nazis were working on. Many of them were given to the Nazis by extraterrestrials or this Sustank consortium, according to Anton Anfilov. Well, if the Nazis were able to do that from 1933, when they rose to power, took over the Vril Society, Flying Saucer Project, and then appropriated it all into a Nazi SS program, and then up until the end of the Second World War, 1945. So if you, in that 12-year period, that if Nazi Germany could develop operational fleets of flying saucer craft and cigar-shaped craft that they could use to fly into space, and they had done it with the help of Earth civilizations. If the Nazis could do that in 12 years, now, wouldn't it stand to reason that in the subsequent 80 years, from 1945, or just say we say 1942, let's say 42, which is when the first retrieved alien spacecraft was taken into the possession of the US Navy and the US Army in 1942, the Los Angeles air raid incident. Let's just take that. So 42. So that we're talking about 82 years ago. So 82 years ago, the US military got their hands on extraterrestrial spacecraft. And since that time, there have been dozens, if not hundreds, of spacecraft. And I think there was a book, Ryan Wood released a book, and I interviewed Ryan about his latest book, Magic Eyes Only, as I recall. And he discussed, I think it was 110 UFO cases that he has found in research and literature. So look at that. So since 1942, there have been over 100 UFO crashes where debris have been recovered, aliens have been recovered. And so in the 82 years since that time, since the earliest recovery, the best scientists in the United States in the 82 years weren't able to reverse engineer it, even though the Nazis were successful in doing it from 1933 to 1945 in 12 years. It's ridiculous. It's truly ridiculous. But this is the position that people like George Knapp, Jeremy Corbell, and David Grush, and many others hold, because they have been exposed to some of the UFO material, but not the deepest layers. What Richard Hoagland describes as the deepest layers, where the lies are different. And so I think this is the problem. So anyway, so I think Anton Anfilov, he does a good job in presenting credible data about the existence of a Nazi UFO Fourth Reich that currently operates in places like Greenland, Antarctica, Argentina, and elsewhere. Okay, so here's a interview that John Lear did back in 1987, and I thought this was very interesting. I rewatched this interview, and he makes some very relevant points that gives us a perspective on what's going on. So 87, so we're talking 37 years ago. So John Lear, and he was being interviewed by George Knapp in this interview, but John Lear is the focus. So let's see what John Lear, the famous test pilot who broke many speed records, flying aircraft, son of the scion of the famous Lear family. So he began researching UFOs, and in 1987 he had quite a bit of information to share. So first, he cited the research of Leonard Stringfield that many UFOs piloted by gray aliens have crashed and been retrieved, which corroborates recent whistleblowers such as David Grush. So that, I think, is very noteworthy, that back in 87, he was studying the work of Leonard Stringfield, who identified, I think it was 50 insider sources that had identified UFO crash retrieval operations that had been underway, and that the debris was being held in classified facilities and was being studied for research and development purposes. And that matches what David Grush said back in 2023. We're talking, 46 years later, David Grush is saying the same thing. And so I thought that was very interesting, that this goes back many decades, back to the 1980s, and a work like Leonard Stringfield, research by Leonard Stringfield was finding these whistleblowers back then. So second, John Lear says that US presidents are given only partial briefings, and that a committee, MJ12, runs ET-related projects. And I think that's absolutely correct. Yes. US presidents, including right up to the current president, whatever you want to call Joe Biden. I won't go there. So Joe Biden and predecessors, Trump and George Bush Jr. and Bill Clinton, George Bush Sr. Now, George Bush Sr. might be in a separate category because he was a former head of the CIA, and he was long involved in covert CIA operations. So he may have been, among the US presidents, probably the most well briefed about UFO phenomena. But nevertheless, I think John Lear is correct that most presidents are not briefed. And back in 1987, at the time, the president was Ronald Reagan. His vice president was George Bush Sr. So George Bush Sr. was very knowledgeable on the issue. Reagan had made some famous statements that revealed that he was only partially briefed. So I thought that was very interesting. Now, here's the kicker. Here's the one that really got my attention with John Lear. And that is that John Lear was saying back in 1987 that retrieved alien spacecraft are too difficult to reverse engineer. Now, that I thought really kind of stood out. I mean, for reasons that I've already described, and I won't repeat those. Now, in addition to what I've already said about people like Ben Rich, about the Nazis developing their own fleets of flying saucer craft, we also have the claims of William Tompkins, who was served in a top secret Navy espionage program conducted out of Naval Air Station San Diego during the Second World War. And he's produced documents, and I have those documents, showing that he was part of a classified program involving briefing packets that would be delivered around the country. And he says that those briefing packets contained debriefings of Navy spies that were embedded in top Nazi corporations that were building these flying saucer crafts for the Nazi war effort. And so William Tompkins said, yeah, of course, the Nazis had successfully reverse engineered those. And that later, that the Navy, by the 1970s, it was very successful with fleets of anti-gravity spacecraft, and that these were some of the larger ones were being built in very remote regions of Utah in the 1980s. Okay, so I think that point by Roger Lear was very interesting, but clearly wrong for reasons I've already described. So, and this was another important point that really makes me, it really raises important issues about John Lear and his credibility. So finally, Lear says that 90% of extraterrestrials are hostile, and he cites researchers such as Bud Hopkins and Linda Moulton Howe, who to support that claim. So Bud Hopkins has talked about abductions, and Linda Howe has talked about cattle mutilations, both of them lending themselves to hypotheses that extraterrestrials are conducting negative activities. Linda Howe has also discussed human mutilations, but hasn't talked about that much. She was told not to. Now, this is where John Lear made a very telling statement. He said that the comments or the evidence or the claims of Billy Meier that he was being contacted by friendly extraterrestrials here to help us raise our consciousness by sharing advanced teachings, the history of the planet, some philosophy of space, and the history of galactic cultures to kind of like expand our consciousness in that way. John Lear dismisses the Billy Meier case, and he dismisses it on the basis of something that I thought was very suspicious. And this is what he said in the interview. He said that, well, the negatives of the photos taken by Billy Meier were never made available for researchers. Well, I know very well from interviewing or talking with Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens, who was one of the original researchers that went over and interviewed Billy Meier, that the CIA had very early on learned about Meier, and what they would do is that they would place operatives or recruit operatives in photographic laboratories that were being used by Meier to create the photos that he was then releasing to the public. And what Wendell Stevens said was that the originals were, or the negatives were being lost, and some of the original photos were being substituted with fakes that were of models being used. And so this was all being done in a way that researchers, probably put onto it by the CIA, would say, oh, this photo looks very strange. Oh, when you study it, that's not a UFO craft. That's a hoax. That's just a model that's being dangled on some sort of high wire. And so that's how the CIA set out to undermine Billy Meier. I mean, that's the fact. I mean, that's the way it happens. Real contactees, they are approached, and if they don't become silent, if they don't work for the intelligence community, then they are compromised, or they are the community around them is infiltrated in some way, so that way they can be discredited. And that's a fact of life. That happens. That's why one really needs to, when it comes to evidence, you need to like really be much more flexible. But here, what we see from John Lear is he's taking this inflexible approach that negatives weren't being supplied to researchers, so Billy Meier's claims were not credible. And so now this is the takeaway here. John Lear was working for the CIA in bringing in a lot of drugs into the country. I mean, that people know about that. He was a civilian contractor for the CIA. He would fly planes for Air America, as I recall, into the United States loaded with drugs. This was a CIA operation. That's how they fund the black budget for deep underground military bases, secret space programs, and so forth. So Lear was a part of that. So I find it very hard to believe that John Lear, given his background with the CIA, his undoubted connections with the CIA, would not know that people like John Lear, people like Billy Meier, who are credible contactees, that the evidence that they are supplying is not being tampered with by CIA operatives that are planted around that particular contactee. That to me suggests that Lear was working at the CIA and was controlled opposition conducting a limited hangout. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, that there are people now within the UFO community that are associated with the CIA that are putting out what is essentially a limited hangout. They are, in other words, controlled opposition. And I won't speculate or say who I think those people are. All right, so here's a a notice, an announcement concerning my upcoming webinar on Russia's secret space program. And in preparing my presentation for the webinar, I came across some really astounding information. And this is where, Russia's secret space program, its origins, the relationship with the enigmatic Psy-Core and the human, non-human connection all comes together in terms of this prophecy by Edgar Cayce that one day Russia would be the hope of the world, and that Russia would defend the planet or would defeat the sons of Belial in their agenda. So what is it? So in 1935, Edgar Cayce, so this is an article I wrote on Exopolitics today, which you can go there and you can read about it. I will make it available in the link below or in the description below. So in 1935, Edgar Cayce predicted that Russia would be, quote, the hope of the world, and that they would free humanity from the sons of Belial. Now, the sons of Belial have been manipulating humanity for millennia, that they were the ones, these were a group, they're known by different names, Satanists, the Cabal, the Illuminati, or the Deep State. This is the same group that brought about the destruction of Atlantis, according to Edgar Cayce. And so they are now in control of the planet, and that Russia would free the world from the sons of Belial. He said that in 1935 about Russia. And now the thing is, could that be accurate? Could what we are witnessing today truly be this kind of like millennia-old struggle between the sons of Belial and the children of the law of one, or we call them white hats, whatever, and that Russia is a part of this, and they are playing a critical role in defeating the sons of Belial or the Deep State. Well, here we have an interview by General Wesley Clark, the former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, and he gave this interview in September of 2001. I think it was a couple of weeks after the September 11 attacks. And he says that he was told by serving generals in the Pentagon, these were people that had previously been subordinates of his, and he went to the Pentagon to visit them. And he's the old Sacco, the old 4-star general that they served under. So, they saw an old boss. And one of these generals came up to him and was really kind of like concerned about what he had learned. And he had learned, and Wesley Clark talked about this in the interview, and the link is there in my article, and you can watch the interview. It's quite, the snippet here. He says that the Deep State, he said that there was a plan to bring about the destruction of 7 countries in the Middle East: Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Iran. And so this was the plan that this general was telling Wesley Clark about. So what's that about? He was asking for advice from Clark, and Clark describes in his interview how he responded to that. So now this takes to my research. Now the planned destruction of these 7 Middle East countries was really an attempt by the Deep State to manufacture a major regional war that would involve Israel and its neighbors, that would suck in the newspapers into opposing sides of a Gog and Magog end times war. And this is something that the Project Camelot, Kerry Cassidy and Bill Ryan, when they launched Project Camelot, one of their first interviews, I think it was in 2010, involved an individual that was associated with the City of London. He was a former Navy commander. We don't know his rank, and he said that there was a plan and to orchestrate a series of wars that would bring about a major regional conflagration that would end in this kind of end times war that would suck in Russia, China, the United States, that everyone would be involved in that. And so this would be the Gog and Magog end times war. And that interview that Kerry and Bill Ryan did with this Navy commander that was part of the management team of the City of London, it's called, that interview was called the Anglo-Saxon Agenda. And so I think you'll find it there still on Kerry Cassidy's Project Camelot website. Well worth looking at that article. It's a very important article. And in fact, I plan to do an interview with Kerry at some point to discuss that article and subsequent things concerning that particular Anglo-Saxon agenda and how it relates today. So the deep state called for the destruction of Syria. This was one of the 7 countries that it was identified by Wesley Clark. But Syria wasn't destroyed. The government of Syria survives. And why does the government of Syria survive when all of these other countries that had been identified by Wesley Clark were destroyed? So if you look at Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, the governments of all of those countries were replaced in destructive civil wars. Why did Syria survive? Why does the regime of Bashar al-Assad continue? Why is that? Well, it's because Russia intervened. Russia decided that it would militarily intervene to prop up the Syrian regime. Now, when did Russia intervene? I forgot the actual year that it did so, probably around 2014, something like that, maybe earlier. But Russia intervened, and because of Russia's support, the Syrian regime, the Ba'athist regime is probably more correct. The Ba'athist regime of Bashar al-Assad has survived. So right there you have a major country that was slated for destruction in this deep state plan being saved by Russia. Okay, very interesting. Okay, so Russia intervened there to save Syria, from the Syrian government, from destruction. And so this is where we get into the idea that the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin has been involved in frustrating the deep state plan, because it wasn't just the destruction of Syria that was also being planned, but it was also the kind of like the breakup of the Russian Federation. And this would involve a war in Ukraine, or that would involve Ukraine being involved in subverting and undermining and eventually bringing about the destruction of Russia. But that was preempted by Russia's special military operation in 2022. And so this is where you get the old idea of the Gog and Magog war, because Russia and Ukraine are part of this area of the world that historically were described as the lands of Gog and Magog. Those 7 countries that Wesley Clark identified, they, along with Ukraine and Russia, make up the lands of Gog and Magog. And in the end times, the lands of Gog and Magog would gang up against Israel, and that there would be a kind of end times war that would be incredibly devastating. So a key feature in this end times war was Iran. So the plan was that Iran would be taken out. So April of 2024 was the month when this takeout of Iran was going to occur. And so you had on April 1st, Israel, or in particular the regime of Benjamin Netanyahu, authorized a strike on Iranian on an Iranian embassy compound in Syria's capital of Damascus. So that was on April 1st. And then what happened was that on April 13, you had a response by Iran, and then 5 days later, you had a response by Israel to Iran's retaliation, which was a retaliation to Israel's strike on April 1st. So in putting together my webinar, which takes place today, so there's time for you to register for the webinar, and I'll go into much more detail into all of this. I talk about sunspot numbers, and I look at I looked at the sunspot numbers for the month of April, and what you see is that the sunspot numbers on April 1st were like 32, 39. That's kind of like at that low end of sunspot activity, 32, 39. And this was when Israel attacked the Iranian embassy compound in Damascus. And then on the 13th, the sunspot numbers, you can see every day. This is the provisional daily international sunspot numbers provided by this organization, the World Data Center for international sunspot numbers. So by April 13, the sunspot numbers had risen up to 120. So now this is when this is when Iran retaliated against Israel and launched, I think it was over 300 drones and missiles that hit all over Israel, and the 99% or well over 90% of them were shot down by Israel and its allies. So there were no real deaths. There were no Israeli casualties. I think there was one girl, a Bedouin, that was seriously injured, but that was the only injury. There were no deaths associated with it. So then on the 18th, 5 days later, you have Israel retaliating again. But Israel's retaliation, that occurred on the day where the sunspot numbers were 223. So this I found to be really very important because sunspot numbers are traditionally very important in terms of the outbreak of major wars. And so I think what happened was that Israel's attack on April 1st was an effort by the deep state to bring about this end times war by ensuring that it would happen at a time where you would have Israel and Iran retaliating against one another, and each level of retaliation would get deadlier and deadlier, and eventually the whole region would explode into a devastating war, a nuclear war that would suck in the United States, Russia, and China on different sides. So why didn't that happen? The sunspot numbers were there to support this kind of aggressive agenda that the deep state have. Why didn't it happen? Russia intervened, and it told the Iranians, tone it down from DEFCON 1 to DEFCON 3. We don't want a war. You don't want a war. No one's going to benefit. You're not going to benefit. No one's going to benefit. So let's do it this way. And so Iran's response to Israel's April 1st attack was done in a way to ensure that Israel would not retaliate. And Russia, through its intermediaries, negotiated with white hats within the United States, military white hats, to ensure that Israel would not retaliate in an overwhelming way to Iran's attack on April 13. And so on April 18, when Israel did attack, it attacked in a way where it could kind of save face and say, yeah, we launched an attack. We taught those Iranians a lesson or two, and that's it. But they did it like behind closed doors. They didn't publicly announce it. They just could within Israel's government, they could say, yeah, we retaliated. it's over. The US doesn't want us to do it. The Russians don't want us to do it. Let's just not escalate and leave it at that. And what was very important was that the Iranians decided that they would not retaliate to Israel's strike within Iranian territory, and that was a result of Russian intervention. So I think Russia's role is critical to preventing this regional war that could have easily broken out into a hot third world war, and so Russia, I think, may well have fulfilled Casey's prophecy of saving the planet. So I'll go into much more detail into this, a whole process in my webinar, how the Russians, different extraterrestrial groups, and its cycle relates to this. The cycle, Russia's cycle, how does that relate to this? To learn about that, do the webinar. It's on today at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 a.m. Pacific Time, and it's going to be 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. So I hope you can join me for that, for my webinar. So that's it. So again, don't forget to like and make sure you get alerts for my webinars. Send it out to friends. For my webinars as well, but also for these podcasts, so that people can see, and the algorithms, the YouTube algorithms, don't suppress these podcasts. So thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Aloha.
You have been listening to Exopolitics today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.